Today we're going to see which quarterbacks are really earning their money in the NFL versus quarterbacks who are significantly underperforming for how much they're really getting paid. I'm going to be covering how many passing yards they have per game, how many rushing yards they have per game, and how many wins they have in total for the duration of the 2021 to 2023 seasons, which were really the years that their contract was based or determined off of, so to say. We'll look at how many passing yards per game they have comparative to how much they're really getting paid. The one thing that really stands out is the fact that Justin Herbert is honestly underpaid for his value, and Trevor Lawrence is honestly fleecing the Jaguars. There's no reason why Trevor Lawrence should have gotten the same amount of money as Joe Burrow with half the success in the passing game. Another player who's also really underperforming his contract, even though he's getting paid not a whole lot at all, is Daniel Jones, the player who just got cut and is now just dead cap for the Giants at this point. Now, when we look at rushing yards per game, there's honestly absolutely no correlation with how many yards you run compared to how much money you're getting paid. For example, you have players like Daniel Jones, Justin Fields, and Lamar Jackson who are rushing for significantly more than how much they're being paid. In comparison, the higher paid quarterbacks such as Jared Goff, Tua, Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, Joe Burrow, they're not rushing for as much at all. In fact, they're actually under the trend line, so they're underperforming their rushing standard for their contract. But there's just no correlation, so it's a stat that we really need to acknowledge and say, I'm impressed by it, but at the same time, there's no connection between how many yards a quarterback runs per game comparative to how much they're really going to make in the NFL. Now, when we look at how many wins they have in total, sure, this doesn't factor in their win percentage. Maybe that would have been a better stat, but availability is the best ability. And to be available and to win is something that we really need to hold highly when it comes to how much money these players are making at the end of the day. And we can see through and through that Jalen Hurts is honestly really overperforming how much he signed for with the Eagles, because he's winning so many games in the regular season. He's getting them to the playoffs consistently for, one thing or two to go wrong here or there in the playoffs, and they just don't bring it together, sadly. On the other hand, though, Trevor Lawrence is really being overpaid for the amount of wins he's giving that team whatsoever. Although, sure, he hasn't exactly had one of the best teams around him, there's no reason why he should have warranted a $55 million per year contract. Same thing with Daniel Jones, who got $40 million to only win 14 games out of 33 games that he really started between 2021 and 2023. On the other hand, you can see quarterbacks such as Justin Herbert, Jared Goff, Tua, and Joe Burrow, who are right where they're supposed to be for how much money they're really making. This time around, we're looking at their completion percentage, the amount of total touchdowns they have rushing as well as passing, and how many fourth quarter comebacks they amount. That does not mean they win the game, that just means that they take the lead in the fourth quarter from a behind position. When we look at completion percentage, one thing we see is that Daniel Jones for the first time is actually above the trend line. And then in comparison, you can also look at someone like Lamar Jackson, who honestly is below the trend line, but he also contributes so much to the rushing game that marginal difference of being below the trend line really doesn't matter too much for how much he's getting paid. But someone who it does matter for is Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, on top of the fact that he is just consistently below the trend line and passing yards per game, as well as the win stats, he is also below in completion percentage, which really goes to show the correlation in the fact that the Jaguars overvalue Trevor Lawrence so much. Because when we look at total touchdowns he's contributed, he's also below the trend line in that for someone who's making $55 million a year. Comparative, we have Joe Burrow, who's making the exact same amount with a total touchdowns of 91. I want to say that is second on this list comparative to Jalen Hurts, who's at 99, as we can see, with right at that 51 million mark category. Right at the 51 million mark, we see Jalen Hurts, who's putting up the most total touchdowns we've seen. Obviously, a lot of them are from tush pushes, and a lot of them were also thrown, but the good balance between the two is really impressive. Now, when we look at Daniel Jones, for example, even though he's the second lowest paid on this chart, we also see that he is the lowest, hands down, when it comes to total touchdowns. Daniel Jones did not contribute to any touchdowns really at all on his team, and he is really just a byproduct of his surrounding. And it's honestly not impressive when you look at someone like Baker Mayfield, who's had really up and down seasons the last 3 seasons, but still he's able to perform up to what his contract value is really worth. Last but not least, we're going to look at fourth quarter comebacks. Now here we have Justin Herbert leading the pack, which is obvious because the Chargers are known for come back in the fourth quarter, losing the game somehow, and just inventing ways to lose. But Justin Herbert nonetheless has led the most fourth quarter comebacks at 10. On the other hand, we can look at Daniel Jones, who also is above the trend line for his stat and for how much he's being paid, as well as Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. Now, people who are below the trend line are players like Joe Burrow, for example, who aren't leading enough fourth quarter comebacks to warrant how much they're getting paid, which really goes to show, do they really value a quarterback who is able to come back in the fourth quarter and have that clutch gene, or do they really see these quarterbacks as quarterbacks who they just get out to a lead and maintain their lead to where they don't have to have any fourth quarter comebacks? That's kind of how I see it personally. So we can look at that, but also you have players like Trevor Lawrence who also just don't win enough. And he doesn't win enough. He cannot amount any fourth quarter comebacks when he's behind to begin with. He doesn't pass for enough yards per game based off of how much he's really making. Trevor Lawrence is really just one of the most overpaid quarterbacks we've seen in the NFL outside of Daniel Jones, in all honesty. I honestly would argue, based off of everything we've covered so far in part 1 and part 2, to say that Trevor Lawrence might be one of the worst NFL contracts currently in the league, at least at the quarterback position. When it comes to turnover opportunity per game, turnover opportunity is, in my opinion, defined as opportunity for turnovers, which include interceptions, as well as fumbles recovered by my team, as well as the opposing team, because that's an opportunity that could go both ways, and I just got lucky that the football bounced into my player's hands rather than someone else's. When we look at that, we can see Baker Mayfield, for example, is quite high, and he is not where you want to be when it comes to turnover opportunity per how much he's making. On the other hand, Daniel Jones, who just got cut, really didn't turn the ball over that much, but he also did throw the ball into the ground a whole lot. His completion percentage was on par with where it's supposed to be, but he just didn't give his team enough opportunity, hence why he got cut. On the other hand, you can look at quarterbacks such as Joe Burrow, for example, Jared Goff, and Justin Herbert, who are all being paid 52 to that 55 million range, and they're really coming through comparative to someone like Tua, for example, who's right in the middle of Jared Goff and Joe Burrow, who is turning the ball over way too much in his first 3 years from 2021 to 2023, and honestly didn't warrant that contract extension that he really got if we're just looking at the turnover number specifically. But last but not least, on the topic of Tua, we're going to go to game started. Availability is the best availability, as I always say, and honestly all 3 parts, which is where we're going to take a look at this and see that you have players like Daniel Jones and Tua and Joe Burrow, for example, who aren't playing enough games for how much they're really getting paid. Sure, it might be load management, it might be injury, but if you're being paid anywhere in the millions, in all honesty, you have to make sure you're available, and they're just not available enough. In comparison, we can look at someone like a Jalen Hurts, like a Trevor Lawrence. This is the only thing that I'll actually ever commend Trevor Lawrence on. Even though he might consistently, when he does play, put up some awful numbers compared to how much he's really making, he's available. And he puts his team in a position to where they don't have to bring in the backup, who sadly is honestly worse than him. So availability is the best ability, and he definitely is the definition of that, so to say. To sum up all of what we've honestly looked over, though, we can say that Trevor Lawrence is significantly overpaid, and he's looking like the next Daniel Jones, except he makes about $15 million more. Daniel Jones, he's already gotten cut, so I say Jalen Hurts definitely does that, as you can see with the wins column, as well as the passing yards per game. I think Jalen Hurts is honestly the most slept on quarterback for how much he's really making. He should be making more. He should be around the Joe Burrow realm. But in reality, he's making about $2.5 million less per year. But good for him nonetheless. He's getting that bag as he should be. All in all, to sum it up, we can say that Trevor Lawrence and Daniel Jones are both overpaid. Jalen Hurts significantly underpaid. Tua, Burrow, Baker, Herbert, and Lamar are all right where they're supposed to be, though, for the most part. That concludes our quarterback analysis breakdown when it comes to contracts, and if you want to see anything else or any other position you want me to compare, or any other players you want me to compare, let me know.